večer, dámy a pánové, vítejte v kempu. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to camp. For everyone that's stayed with us for the entire day, thank you for staying for the evening public lecture as well. For all the ones that just joined us, welcome to camp. For a very special guest today for us. Actually, 4 years ago, when we were only thinking about opening this space, and we were traveling around Europe, looking at Pavillon d'Arsenal in Paris and other architectural centers around Europe, we went to London, and Peter showed us the NLA, the New London Architecture, and in a way, it was inspiration for us and for this place. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Peter Murray. He's an architect, but rather than practicing it, he's been writing about architecture and design all his life. He is the director of London Festival of Architecture, as well as he founded the New London Architecture, which I've mentioned before. He's also the design advocate for Mayor Sadiq Khan. We'd definitely talk about that in the upcoming lecture as well. And yeah, but without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Peter Murray.
Mayor's design advocate. I run New London Architecture, but also I'm totally fascinated by cities. I love talking about cities. I love coming to cities and seeing them, and it's great to be here in this very beautiful historic city. So I'm going to talk initially about the historic centre of London, and then I'm going to go on and talk about the wider London plan, which is developed by Mayor Sadiq Khan. And so for those of you who were here earlier today, I'm going to repeat some of the things that I said about the City of London, but hopefully hearing it twice will mean even more to you. So I'm going to start off by just putting London in context. It obviously sits in the southeast of England, but one of the problems is that we don't have a regional plan in London. We have a government that doesn't believe in regional planning. So London actually operates very much as a single entity, and this is the red line is the border of the Greater London Authority, which is run by the Mayor Sadiq Khan, and I'll be talking more about it later, but around the outside of London is a green belt where development is very difficult to take place. So London operates very much as a entity on its own in terms of both development and planning. And this is the City of London, right in the heart of the capital, and that is the historic core. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But I first have to explain, and this is often very confusing, the City of London is different to London as a whole. The City of London is the historic core. The City of London has at its head the Lord Mayor, and there's been a Lord Mayor of the City of London since the 12th century. It's one of the oldest democratic institutions in the world. And then on the right-hand side is Sadiq Khan, who is Mayor of London, meaning the Greater London area. And we have only had an elected mayor in London since the year 2000. And one of the main jobs of the elected mayor is to write the London plan, which is a strategic plan for the whole of the capital. But I'm going to start with the City of London, which is the historic core. And this is where the Romans came in 40 AD, and they stayed in London until about the 5th century. And they developed a grid and a wall around the city, which still impacts on development today. And they crossed the river here, and they settled in this particular part because this was the easiest place to build a bridge. And so it's a really pragmatic reason why they happen to have settled at this particular spot in the river. and the river has been a key part of London's development ever since. Now, when the Romans went back, the city developed over a period of time, and this is a plan of in the 15th century. It developed into a very busy mercantile centre. As you can see, very narrow streets, very crowded, pretty unhealthy place to be, and it was surrounded not just by a Roman wall, but also a medieval wall was built around it as well, and that constrained the extent of the City of London, and a lot of the area around it was at the time just green fields and for agricultural use. And one of the problems of narrow streets and also the timber house it was built of, they are pretty unhealthy and also tend to go up in flames if you're not careful. And so in 1666, slightly before you had a great fire here, we had the Great Fire of London, and that destroyed 80% of the buildings in the city. Now, fires in medieval cities were quite common, really, but this one is very interesting because it really defines very much how London has developed ever since. And one of the key aspects of that is that the king wanted to build a new city with wide streets, vistas, a Renaissance city that was the sort of thing they would see when they go to Rome or Paris. They didn't want the same sort of crowded medieval environment that they'd had up until that time. But the problem is that the merchants wanted to get back to business straight away. They didn't want to wait for 10 years while there was a new master plan drawn up. They didn't want to wait while new land ownership patterns were defined. So they wanted to get back to work, and their argument won over the king's requirement that he wanted a modern city, and so they went ahead and they built their businesses back on exactly the same plots that they had before the fire. So although the architects, architects always like destroying cities because then they can rebuild something which is new and totally without the impact of history on it, but the merchants won. Now, this is an example of the way that London's planning still works today. London is essentially a pragmatic city. It is where the mercantile classes have enormous power. It's rather like New York in that way, but also we are a pragmatic planning authority because in Britain we have what is called common law. Common law is based on precedent and it is based on argument and discussion. So our legal system is not really attuned to grand plans. Our system is much more attuned to argument and debate and coming out with a shared solution at the end of it. So in that case, the merchants won the argument with the king, and they went ahead and, as I say, built their premises on the same sites they had before. The other thing that came out of the Great Fire was also very important, was that it was the first time we had building regulations that could actually be enforced. And so what the rules said after the fire was that all buildings should be built of brick, and they should have a whole series of details which would stop the spread of fire in the future. And that image of terraced housing, very specific facades and facade treatment really impacted on the way that London was developed over the next 200 years. So the Great Fire was important not just because the very unhealthy city that was there before was destroyed, but also it was important because it illustrated these aspects about how we develop in London even to this day. So you have the City of London here, and after the fire, a lot of people wanted to move outside of the city, and there was a lot of development taking place to the west of the historic area. And you can see how London was built up after the Great Fire. You have here St. Paul's Cathedral, enormously out of scale with all the existing buildings around it, but dominating the environment here. This is by Canaletto, and you can see here this very jagged skyline created by the 52 churches which were built after the fire, and the spires have a real impact on the way that the city looks, and is something which I think in a different way is reinterpreted in the modern skyscraper. As I say, there was a lot of development that happened to the west of the historic city, and this was largely on agricultural land, so there was plenty of space to develop squares and open spaces, and these lands were owned by aristocratic families, and they looked to Paris. This is the Place de Vosges, which was originally developed in about the first part of the 17th century, and you can see now this is Grosvenor Square, which still exists in the West End of London, and they definitely copied the Paris example as a way of creating high-quality residential with public space in the centre. Grosvenor Square is still owned by the same family who owned it back then in the 17th century. And in fact, a large part of London's West End is still owned by these families, who are the wealthiest families in the country, because they developed a really interesting and profitable way of dealing with development, which still continues to this day, where they leased a part of their land to developers. The developers built the houses, and at the end of the lease, generally 99 years, the landowner would get back the land, but also would get back the buildings on them. And you can see that pattern which still exists, and I'll go through a couple of examples in a moment. So this is Regent Street, one of the key retail streets in London. This was developed in 1812, architect John Nash, and this is actually on land owned by the Crown Estate, which is basically the Queen's property, which is now managed by the government in order to give the Queen an income, but also bring in lots of taxation into their government coffers. And so this was developed, as I say, beginning of the 19th century, and then 99 years later, when the lease fell in, it was redeveloped by the next generation of the Crown Estate to deliver a new building. And each 99 years, that development keeps continuing on. So London started to grow, and in the 19th century, and this is a picture of the City of London in the mid part of the century. As you can see, St. Paul's Dome, very powerful icon in the skyline of the city. But in the 19th century, London grew until it was actually at that time the largest city in the world, very successful trading city, and it grew, as you can see here, from 1840. It continued to spread outwards until in the in the 1930s, it had large suburban population spread out to the outer areas, and was growing in density until at the beginning of the Second World War, it had reached a population of 8.6 million people. And then we, during the Second World War, during the Blitz, again, you can see St. Paul's very powerful in terms of the skyline. It was, there are lots of very popular photographs of it amongst the smoke of the Blitz, and it became a real symbol of London's resistance to the bombing that was going on. But it meant that after the war, there was a change in attitude to planning. A new plan was developed, which really was based on the idea that cities were fairly unhealthy, overcrowded, not sort of places people particularly wanted to live in great density. And so a lot of development took place in new towns, new settlements, out in the green fields which surrounded the capital. So London actually saw a period of reduction in population as people moved out into new towns, places Milton Keynes, Horsham, Hemel Hempstead, Harlow. These were all new towns, totally new planned settlements where people moved to and were emptied out of London. There were a few examples that bucked that trend, and this is the brutalist design of the Barbican development in the City of London, and a dense and very well-designed space with very nice public spaces in between, some, what I think are very elegant towers, and some really good accommodation right in the centre of the city. At the same time, in the post-war period where buildings had been demolished in the City of London, we were developing buildings a bit like this, not great architecture, and built during periods of rationing, so actually not really very well built. But one of the advantages of these buildings is that nobody liked them very much. So when we came to redevelop them, nobody complained about knocking them down and building something new. And so we needed to build a lot of new office buildings, particularly in the City of London. In 1986, what we call Big Bang happened. And so this is an image of, at that time, this is Broadgate, a major development taking place, which was delivered for Big Bang. The Big Bang was the deregulation of the banking system, which meant that changes which took place because of new communication technology meant that banking was operated in a very different way. Up until Big Bang, if you were a bank, you had to be within 5 minutes walk of the Bank of England, because every night you had to go to the bank and hand in a letter which said how much money you still had in your bank so that you would keep on trading. As soon as digital communications came into place, that didn't, the whole geography of the city could change. People didn't need to be within walking distance of the Bank of England at all. They could actually be anywhere in London, or indeed they could be in Bangalore or somewhere totally different and still carry on their business. But this is Broadgate, the site we were just looking at as it was developed. This was developed to meet the needs of banks coming into London, lots of American banks, Korean banks, Japanese banks. And one of the things they needed was large floor plates, sometimes up to about 6,000 square meters, where traders on their floors could actually see everybody. They were all working on computers, and they needed this large-scale environment to work. And so Broadgate was built over railway lines, and that generated large floor plate buildings. It was also one of the first developments in London where you had large-scale development where public space was really seen as a very important part of delivering a high-quality development. And this really set the trend and has been followed by many developments since then. And it's been very successful. This is a photograph taken not long ago of the centre of Broadgate. This is what it's like most evenings on a fine day. Very popular place for people to come together, have a drink after work. And it's a space that can be used for installations. This is the London Design Festival, which was on last week, and this is an installation which has been put into the public space there. As a result of Big Bang, Canary Wharf started to be developed. Canary Wharf is aimed specifically at the financial sector, is about 5 or 6 kilometres to the east of the City of London. And the advantage there, it was developed within an area which was old Docklands area, and that meant that they were able to easily provide the large floor plates that the American banks required. So it is actually, might say, a little piece of Manhattan. It's designed on a North American style grid. All the office buildings are rectangular, very efficient office space, and they provide the sorts of space that a lot of the American banks required at the time. This was much more difficult to do in the City of London because this is where the impact of the Great Fire was so important, is that the ground plan of the City of London was still based on a 16th century layout. So it was very difficult to get the large floor plates that were needed to deliver the sorts of accommodation that banks needed at the time. But, and the city resisted the idea of delivering tall buildings for a long time, but in the end it was seen necessary to compete then with Canary Wharf. And the first new tall building that went up in the City of London was this building by Foster and Partners, or Foster Associates, I think it was called at the time when it was designed. And this is a building that fundamentally changed attitudes in Britain to tall buildings. Up until then, people had generally thought they were ugly concrete monstrosities. This was the first building people saw you could have a tall building which can be very beautiful and can actually add positively to London's skyline. And so over the years, there have been a number of really high-quality tall buildings which have been developed in the City of London. And this is the Leadenhall building, designed by Rogers Stirk Harbour. And this is also nicknamed the cheese grater because of its slightly triangular shape. Reminded the city planning director in London of a cheese grater. So we do actually call quite a lot of the tall buildings, particularly in the city cluster, by nicknames. So the Gherkin is obviously one of them. There's the cheese grater, and then there's another one which everyone's least favorite building is called the walkie-talkie, designed by Raphael Vignoli. So one of the issues that happens in dense urban environments where you have tall buildings, you have several thousand people coming down to ground level in a crowded space, is that you need to create places where people can mingle, they can walk. And this was one solution created by Rogers Stirk Harbour at the base of the Leadenhall building, where there is an open 6-story atrium, and this allows public to go through under the building, and also there's a lot of events that happen under that space, but it adds to the available space for pedestrians. And this is a building which is just about nearing completion at the top at the moment, called 22 Bishopsgate. And you can imagine what the impact of all the people coming out of this building it will have on the pavements below when they come out at the end of the day. And so a lot of work is being done in the city to actually improve the quality of the ground space beneath it. And if all the buildings actually happen that are proposed, and this is another tower which will be a very, very close neighbour to the existing ones, designed by the architect Eric Parry. When all those buildings, the people working in them emerge onto the street, you really have to look very carefully as how you create the space that people can occupy well and in a way that is both safe and gives a positive experience. And we'll talk a little bit about how that can be done in a moment, but using the base of the building to deliver additional space is also something that Eric Parry has used here on the building that he's designed. When this will be developed, nobody's quite sure at the moment because of the uncertainties in the market right now. And public space is also a key element in the design of the Bloomberg building, again by Foster and Partners, where public space, the recreation of an existing, of an old street, which was covered up. And this is interesting because it is one of the few large sites in the City of London which was actually put together in the post-war period when nobody really wanted to develop buildings very much in the City of London because of the destruction all around it. But one very foresighted agent did actually amalgamate this site into a single large site, which was developed by one of those rather ugly buildings, ugly post-war buildings, which was then demolished to make way for a much better one. So as I was saying, London grew to a population of about 6.8 million at the beginning of the Second World War. It started to reduce as people moved out to the new settlements which were being built around outside London. And then it, as you can see from this graph, in the 1990s, it started to increase again. And there were a couple of reasons why that happened. First of all was the impact of Big Bang, meant that there were a lot of highly paid workers moving into the City of London. It became a real magnet for them, but also the immigration from the EU increased at that time, and also the change in attitudes to cities, that people wanted to live back in the center of cities again. Young people wanted to move into cities because it was exciting and interesting. Older people wanted to stay in cities because of the facilities, the theatres, and all the other amenities. And so city living, not just in London, but around the world, really became much more popular, and we started expanding again. So actually, just over 3 years ago, we got back to the 8.6 million that we had in the period up until the Second World War. So looking at I've talked a lot about the City of London, just the centre. Looking at the wider London now, this is really how things operate. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan now, but we've had two previous mayors. One was Ken Livingstone. He was the mayor in 2000. 2008, he was replaced by Boris Johnson, who you might have heard of, and then by Sadiq Khan just 3 years ago. And Sadiq Khan will come up for re-election. It's a 4-year term, re-election next year. So the government, when they created an elected mayor, the government wanted to make sure the mayor didn't have too much power. The government didn't really like the idea that mayors actually are elected by many more people than members of parliament. Members of parliament are only elected by about 30 to 40,000 people. A mayor is elected by about 2 million. So they are actually, in the eyes of the wider public, a very powerful force. And of course, the government doesn't really like that too much. So they restrained a lot of the expenditure that the mayor has. So the mayor only really looks after transport, police, fire, inward investment, and planning. So strategic planning is the key thing that I'm going to talk about now. Then we can't forget the 33 London authorities who look after actual planning applications. So if you are planning a building, your first application goes to the borough, and the mayor only interferes with that if it's a strategic project and he doesn't agree with the decision taken by the borough. So Ken Livingstone, he was a left-wing mayor. One of the key legacies that he created was the Olympics in Stratford in East London. And he wasn't at all interested in sport. He wasn't. We didn't actually even think we were going to win it at the time. But he knew that just by applying for the Olympics, that this would generate investment in East London. East London has traditionally been the poorest part of the city. It was impacted by the fact that a lot of it was docks, and the docks closed down in the 1960s with containerization, which moved to the mouth of the River Thames. And also it was a manufacturing area. Manufacturing has been reducing in London over the last 30 years, and particularly impacted by manufacturing jobs going to the Far East. So a poor area of London, and the Olympics had a big impact on generating investment, generating new infrastructure, and helping to put the place back on its feet. Another key part of his policy was the delivery of public space, and this is probably his most iconic project. This is Trafalgar Square, where the area here, so in theory quite a simple project, again designed by Foster and Partners, was to link across. This was a road, and it became pedestrianized, and that connected the National Gallery into the public space below. So now called peninsularization. A lot of traffic roundabouts have been changed, and it makes a much more much pleasanter environment, and this is now much improved and better space to be in. And public space projects across London have done a lot to improve the quality of life in our streets. And that is something that Sadiq Khan is focusing on, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. One of the key roles of the mayor is also to deliver new housing. And I show this particular project because it exemplifies one of the, might say, legacies of the Boris Johnson administration in London, which is dubbed the New London Vernacular. And it means that it's an architecture which uses brick, which as mayor he insisted on because it actually weathers better than many other materials. It addresses the street. It has not always quite so traditional look as it doesn't need to have pitched roofs, but you can see now right across London a whole generation really of houses, of blocks of flats like this, which are use brick, standardized frontages, they say address the streets, have inset balconies, and while perhaps looking slightly ordinary, they do actually stop the worst. They create a sort of mid-range of decent houses, which I think people who live in them find pretty acceptable, but Ava wouldn't probably follow your desire for more exciting architecture. And they're also used in larger scale mansion block styles like this. These are designed by a range of architects termed by Sir Peter Cook, the critic and architect, and of Archigram as the Biscuit Boys, i.e. these are people who produce houses which look like they're built of biscuits, which is, well, bricks really, but at the same time it's delivering a whole lot of, I might say, that sort of calmer, more traditional looking housing. There has been a real accent on taller buildings right across London. They were, at the beginning of the century, they tended to be mainly commercial buildings, but actually from 2008, 2009 onwards, focus much more on residential. So these are some of the typical towers proposed for sites around London. And this is a part of a need to deliver housing more densely, and also an enthusiasm, particularly with Ken Livingstone, for tall buildings. And he believed that tall buildings really made a positive impact of the image of a city, that it was seen to be forward-looking, progressive, and responsive to change. Now, one of the things that we have to deal with, of course, is to decide where we put these buildings when they are proposed, and whether sites are appropriate for tall buildings. And this is what we call the view management framework. And where these red lines meet, this is St. Paul's Cathedral, this is the Houses of Parliament, and views of these iconic buildings from particular vantage points are protected. So you cannot build tall buildings within the sight lines of these views. So that you can see here in looking at the City of London. You've got these view corridors here, and now it would not be permitted to build tall buildings in these particular zones. These are partly the views and partly the impact behind the building that the views would have. And so that means that tall buildings will actually happen where there are no constraints in the view management framework. And a lot of the schemes along here on the south bank, which the ones that are proposed are like that. Now, not all this hasn't been built yet, but a couple of these have, and these are just about to start. And you can see here, City of London, this eastern cluster of tall buildings, which sits outside those view corridors. And this is a view of the City of London's cluster, this idea of a hill or mountain of tall buildings. This is the pinnacle here, going down to the lower scale buildings towards the river. This is what I called the walkie-talkie here, designed by Raphael Vignoli, and nobody can explain to me why this was allowed to happen here, because it's actually not within the cluster, but I believe there are plans now to fill the gap to make it look not quite so out of place. But this mountain, again, drops away to the St. Paul's view. This is from Waterloo Bridge, and then you have a lower area before you then see the Dome of St. Paul's framed by the taller buildings around it. One of the other aspects which is now very prevalent across London, but these are a couple of projects within the city, is that culture is seen as a key part of development and the need to build strong communities. This is the redevelopment of the Museum of London, which is going to be put into an old market building. And this is interior of a reconstruction of a very fine dome, which is in the center of that building. And this is the new music center, which is proposed by the city by Dilys Scofidio. And this is seen as a key attraction to people coming to work in the city, as well as to local Londoners as well. And this is reflected right across a number of other areas around Stratford, where the Olympics are. There's a new cultural centre being built there with the Victoria and Albert Museum, Smithsonian Institute, a new fashion quarter. And we also have a London-wide Borough of Culture competition, which is part of making local authorities conscious of the requirement to deliver more culture locally. And this is the inside of the music centre in London, rather fine. It looks a little bit like the Elbe Philharmonie, which has been very successful in generating real activity and vibrancy to Hafen City in Hamburg. One of the key projects of the Mayor is also to deliver new infrastructure, and this is a long-term project which we have at the moment, which is for building a large drain which goes down the River Thames. And one of the problems we have is that we have a 19th century sewage system, which now, particularly when we have flash floods from heavy rainfall, probably as a result of climate change, that some of the sewage from the 19th century system overflows into the Thames, creating pollution. And so there is this is being dug at the moment. It's I think about a 23 billion euro project, major project to reduce the pollution in the Thames and take sewage out to East London. And this is the sort of scale of it. This is one of the connections down into the pipe, which is under the River Thames. We're also delivering what is called Crossrail 1, but is about to be renamed the Elizabeth Line. And this is a fast underground system which goes from west to east, right through the centre of town. This is having a major impact on delivery of and development of housing in outer London, and also generating greater development within the central area. So this is a map showing the various bits of development. Here's the Elizabeth Line going through the middle here. Then there's a plan for Crossrail 2, which will go north-south, but we're waiting for the government to approve the business plan for that. There are plans to extend the underground line, the Bakerloo line, and also a high-speed link to Birmingham in the north is under construction now. So these are major infrastructure projects will actually improve public transport throughout London, and public transport is key to Sadiq Khan delivering a lot of his strategies, much of which is around reducing the impact of the car on the city, and clearly we need better public transport system if we're going to do that. And the sort of problem that Sadiq Khan faces at the moment is, we were 8.6 million. Latest count is we're now up to 9.3 million. That's 70,000 new citizens every year coming into London. They all have to be housed, they all have places to work, and they all need the infrastructure to support that. We're looking at 10.8 million people by 2041, and that means having to build 66,000 new homes each year. But the best we've done is actually last year, where we got up to 40,000. So we're not anywhere near really delivering the numbers we need, and that is having a real impact on the problems of particularly younger people being able to afford to stay and live in London. So the average of a one-bed apartment per month is anywhere around €1,000, or even a smallish flat is nearly €500,000. So these are costs which actually do have a real impact on young people staying in the city, and the mayor is absolutely realizes that younger people are the key to a strong economy, and so it's really important that that's something which is sorted out. This is called the key diagram, which really shows a lot of the sort of fundamental aspects of the London plan. And the London plan, basically, there are growth corridors going out to key connections outside London. But one of the important things from my point of view is looking at areas where development takes place and densification can take place. And these red dots and also some of these urban centres, metropolitan centres, are seen as opportunity areas by the mayor where you can have more development and build more densely. But it is absolutely essential that if you are building more densely, you also build with very good public transport connections so that you don't have to rely on the motor car. And this is an example. This is obviously one of the more prominent opportunity areas. This is around Stratford and the Olympic site. So you can see in the picture the velodrome from the cycling, but also new housing development, which is taking place on the Olympic Park. It's a key opportunity area. This is another one. This is called Nine Elms in South London. This was an industrial site with sheds and storage facilities. This was rezoned in 2009 and is now developed with the American embassy there. And right in the top of the picture, you have Battersea Power Station, which is being converted into the headquarters or European headquarters for Apple, as well as a major retail centre. This is called Greenwich Peninsula, and this is right next to Canary Wharf. So Greenwich Peninsula has the Millennium Dome at the top, designed by Richard Rogers and Partners, and that is now the O2 event space, the most popular concert venue in the world. And the rest of the site is being developed by the Hong Kong developer Night Dragon, and we have quite a lot of investment from Chinese investors and developers in London at the moment, and this whole site is being delivered by them at the moment, with about 15,000 people living there and about 6,000 or 7,000 jobs. And then this is a large housing scheme called Meridian Water, further out, more in a suburban area, but a large-scale master plan to deliver housing for the local borough. And it's the boroughs who have the responsibility to deliver the numbers of houses that the mayor sets out in his London plan that each borough should deliver. And one of the reasons why we're building more tall buildings and we have to build more densely is that London is surrounded by this green belt. It's a green belt which can be up to 30 kilometers in depth, and it's very difficult to develop within the green belt. And anyway, Sadiq Khan has said that he will not touch the green belt for development, but that all development needs to take place either on brownfield sites or on public land that could be made available for development. And a green city is very much a part of his programme. At the moment, London has 47% of London's area is green. It's either parks, squares, or gardens. The target is to take that up above 50%, and also to use the existing green space. And this is a map of all the current largest green spaces to create what is called a London Park City, the National Park City, which will connect up a lot of the green spaces so that they can work much better as a coherent pattern of greenery running through the city. The other aspect of healthy and better living that is focusing on at the moment is called healthy streets. And for anyone designing a new street in a master plan or making changes to streets, this is a sort of checklist which is required in order to show how you can deliver it in a healthier way. At the moment, it has clean air, pedestrians can use it more easily, it's easy to cross, shade and shelter, it's not too noisy. These are all factors which need to be taken into account to create a healthy street. And the sort of wider program that delivers that is initially this ultra-low emission zone, which covers the central part of London. That will expand over the next few years to reduce the amount of pollution in the city. And there are quite punitive costs involved with that. And so you can see here, this is what we have at the moment, a relatively small area in the center. And by 2021, the aim is that that will get much larger. And as you can see here, that you have substantial fines or taxes to pay that if you go into those areas without having efficient engines. This has been actually quite beneficial for transport because the Transport for London have actually received about £51 million in income from that, which goes towards spending on new cycle routes and other green additions to the system. But also it has had about a 30% reduction in emissions, and that's only started in April. So it's been really, really effective and has made a big difference to pollution levels in the city. One of the difficult things, though, is what you do in the outer London area without cars, because if you can remember that image of all the new transport infrastructure we're building, almost all of that goes straight into the center. It doesn't help in orbital connections getting around the city. And we did a study not long ago about movements of Uber vehicles in London, and Uber tends to have a lot of movement around the outer London area, largely because public transport there is really very poor. Most people drive, and if you're young and you don't have a car, then you use Uber. So at the moment, there are plans to look at how we can provide demand-responsive, digitally driven connections to deliver on-demand buses of various kinds around this area to improve orbital connections. So this is, I might say, a typical rendering of the sorts of central area streets that the mayor is looking to deliver, where you have wider pavements, good segregated cycle lanes, reduced space for cars, good public transport connections, and around good public transport connections, you build higher density housing, so that you've got people can go straight from their apartment into the public transport system and on their way to work. And then this is a more local design where you reduce the through movement of vehicles in residential areas by blocking off so you can't get a vehicle through here, improve sustainable urban drainage, lots of bike storage available for people using bicycles, and generally improved pedestrian space. And there's quite a lot of work being done to get there. It takes a bit of time for these things to happen, and a lot of us wish that Sadiq Khan would get on with it a bit quicker, but it is happening. It's very consultative, and the closest we've really got to it yet is this was last weekend when we had Car-Free Day, which was really successful, using streets right around London for other purposes, and it It's taken us a long time to getting around to doing a car-free day, but hopefully we'll be doing them more regularly now. And this gives at least people some idea of what the potential of streets are, which are used in a much more amenable way than being filled with cars, lorries and vans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Right now, I'd like to invite two more guests to join us. One of them is Dan Siebert, a senior partner at Foster & Partners, and Jakub Klaška from Zaha Hadid Architects. And you'll have plenty of time to ask questions, both Peter and our other guest. So come on up. So you guys saw the presentation. You know London quite well. So maybe I'm just going to ask for an initial reaction. Do you agree with the vision and the assessment that Peter has put forth today? Maybe Don.
Thank you. I think seeing the mayor's vision more completely, I think, is very interesting, particularly the strategic side. To me, the big question is what the real vision of London going forwards to the future as a city should be. Where do we think it ends up? But also, maybe the piece that I think is missing is how technology will change how we experience the city. We've done quite a lot of work recently looking at particularly the influence of electric car infrastructure or renewable infrastructure, and simply looking at how that changes what street patterns are about. So even with, you know, the mayor's vision of streets as they are at the moment, I think we see that changing more radically as the way we move around actually changes on the way through. So I think, to me, of the piece that I would, I guess, want to see more of is that idea of where the future really exists. But I guess also a question to you, Peter. I mean, what do we think the real future of London is? What are we thinking it should become as a city?
Right. Okay. Well, oh, I've got a microphone. Yes, I've forgotten I've even got this on. Yes. Well, I mean, there's what I think and what is probably going to happen. I mean, I think there is real idea that London should continue to grow, largely because when it wasn't growing in that period between the end of the Second World War and 1990, you know, shrinking cities are not great places to be. You get lack of investment. You get generally rundown services, rundown buildings, and there is a belief that you know, London should grow. But then we have to be very conscious of you know, how we deliver that growth without delivering unsustainable developments at the same time. I would say that you know, one of the biggest problems that we have in London is, as I said at the beginning, that we are very much defined by the green belt. We're defined by the edge of the Greater London Authority, and we have no proper regional planning in Britain at the moment. A Conservative government does not really believe in planning. I think they think it's a sort of Marxist plot, and that really we do need to look at the wider southeast region, because the wider southeast region is the economic centre which supports London, and the green belt at the moment, one has to question whether it does the job that it set out to do as well as it should. And I'm chairman of the London Society, which was started in 1912, and was actually one of the organisations which promoted the green belt in the 1930s, which then became law after the Second World War. And one of the key roles of the Greenbelt was to stop urban sprawl, which is a good thing, was provide leisure facilities. But actually, one of the problems we have at the moment is that if you're trying to look for somewhere to live, you have a 30-kilometer journey to get one way. So you're actually adding 60 kilometers to a commute just to get over the Greenbelt to find somewhere where there is accommodation. Yet there are railway lines going right through the Greenbelt with stations that around those stations you could actually develop perfectly sustainable conurbations which would not really impact and destroy the Greenbelt. So I would say London needs to be thought of more regionally than we do at the moment, and it needs to be seen as an economic centre.
I was going to follow up on that, but Dan, do you have something you'd like to add?
I guess, is it on? Yes. I guess the question is also where the future lies in an economy that's, we think, going to change. I mean, ultimately, we're seeing a lot of different kinds of industries and smaller industries coming into London now. It feels like it's changing again to us as a place. Away, I mean, it's not the financials aren't there. They're still incredibly strong in relationship to what we do, but actually it feels like it's becoming more diverse. And maybe people are becoming more interested in a very ethical approach to where living in the city should be. And that seems a good thing to us.
Well, yes, I don't think necessarily everything we're doing at the moment is unethical. So I think,
Sorry, I
think
wasn't
you're right.
implying that.
Ethical is good, and yeah, there are key changes happening to the economy, and the financial services sector has only grown by about 1.6% over the last decade, whereas tech has grown by hugely more than that. Creative sector has grown, and the developments that are taking place, I think, are responding to that. But it is seen that that sort of growth is a good thing for London. The knowledge economy is another key area that is having impact on certain parts of London. And I mean, I would guess if you don't support growth, you support a static economy or a reducing economy.
I'm going to ask Jakub, because just if you sort of forget for a bit that you're an architect, that you're a person that lives and works in London, right? There's been huge changes in the landscape of London, but what's happened to you as a person living there? Have these changes been more positive or more negative?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in density. I think that dense urban environments are actually part of our sustainable future. I sort of see cities as kind of our common civilizatory achievement. So I think, and that they need, and cities need us to enable a kind of further densification and further growth. And I think the particular attention to the ground level of a city that you presented, I think it's probably the right answer, because then we're getting into the ideas of a shared economy, etc. We actually getting into the ideas of spending our leisure time and our free time in the city, and then the city needs to enable that. So yeah, I mean, I pretty much kind of welcomed, some of the ideas that were presented, and I'm kind of, in my world, cities are the kind of sustainable future.
Well, we had a very good exhibition at NLA, which was a walking plan for London, designed by ZHA, and that was a citywide network of walking streets, which would actually connect streets up so that they formed a proper part of like a public transport system, that they would have routes and connections, and certain areas would be designated for pedestrians only. And it's a very different sort of project than one normally expects from Zaha Hadid Architects, but made a very positive contribution into that whole debate about creating a more amenable city.
I think also, it's not a London specialty, but it's to a certain extent been used there. They increased the private investors not only build the buildings, but the things in between the buildings, these called privately owned public spaces. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, and I was wondering what your opinion is. Are they working? And if they are, or if they aren't, what could they be done to do better?
Yeah, I think that, you know, this, when it comes to this topic, it's always about the kind of the discussion of the accessibility and the kind of, you know, the accessibility of the wider audience. And I always add that nobody maybe even realizes that kind of 100% of the great London parks are actually all shut at night, you know, and that doesn't come to us as a surprise for anyone, and we all kind of celebrate them. So I think that's probably, I mean, they are actually perceived by the general public as our kind of common ownership in a way. I mean, mentally, I feel. So I think it's yeah, I think so. I don't have any kind of negative opinion on kind of privately owned public spaces if they kind of enable sufficient accessibility, and on the other hand, they can be kind of well maintained. So I think that's among the obvious advantages.
What about you, Don? Are the POPs working?
I think so, but I also highlight something which I think is really important when we think about how we approach planning, and that is that it is important that every development effectively gives something back to the city. It can't simply be one way. It has to be a two-way conversation, and that two-way conversation that exists in the provision of public spaces, in the provision of new routes which connect different parts of the city, in the provision of new transport infrastructure, whatever it has to be. And again, we as architects work within that realm. And I think that's a key principle in all development, is it simply cannot be one way, it has to be both ways.
I mean, there's a lot of nonsense talked about privately owned public accessible space, in that actually a lot of that space, before it was developed into accessible space, was totally inaccessible. So, for instance, where Canary Wharf is, which was in the docks, there was always a big wall around that, so nobody could get in and steal things from the docks. That was the docks were never accessible. Now it's accessible. I would say, though, that there are issues to do with the way that some of these spaces are managed, and there should be a sort of code of management that actually makes them operate to a similar level. You know, Canary Wharf is a good case in point. As you drive up to Canary Wharf, then there are security guards dressed in uniforms that look very much like police uniforms. So a lot of people could be fooled into thinking these are proper policemen, but they're not. They're just people. I mean, for various reasons, Canary Wharf has very high security level, but it makes you realize as soon as you go into it that this is not a normal public space. Whereas if you go to King's Cross, which I think is generally accepted to be one of the best regeneration projects anywhere, probably anywhere in the world, I think, you can walk in there and people have no feeling that they're going into somewhere which is different. It works very well. It's well managed and well looked after.
I mean, I think that normalization is the key. That it shouldn't feel odd. Yeah. It shouldn't feel like you're being looked at. It should just simply feel like it's something that is part of the city you live in.
Is there at this point someone who would like to ask a question for any of our guests? There we go, in the back. I'll be faster.
Thank you very much. I have one question which I wanted to ask before, but I would like to ask now. In Prague, we have the problem that many residents kind of leave the city center, the historical city center, and go to live in the suburbs. I think in London, I'm sure there's a similar trend, but I would like to ask you, what do you do to kind of face this trend and kind of bring people back to the city center, so it's not only about, you know, Airbnb and companies? Thank you very much.
Shall I start that one? Yes. I would say that there are a couple of aspects to that. One is that there is in most of the boroughs in central London, there is a relatively high proportion of what was all public housing and is now partly public housing and partly privately owned because public housing gets sold off to its occupiers. So if you go to a place like Camden or Hammersmith or Southwark, you have quite a good mix of people who are able to afford to stay in the centre. But I would say that there is a pretty general shift of people who prefer to move slightly out of London when they have children. And certainly a lot of the new developments that have taken place in the centre, particularly the towers, they're all 1 and 2 bedroom accommodation aimed at younger occupiers who only look to be staying in those towers for a certain period of time, and then when they generally have children, they'll move out of those into other areas, sometimes further out. Some people are able to afford to buy reasonably sized accommodation in the centre, but that's a relatively small number of people who can do that.
But still, if I can follow up, I mean, gentrification must be still a huge part of London and living in London. Is there, by the current mayor, is there a scheme or a target for affordable housing, or is that something that's not being addressed so much?
I would say affordable housing is right there at top of the agenda. One of the problems we have of defining precisely what affordable means. The general view of what affordable is it is a percentage of the local market rate in that particular area, and sometimes that's 80%. And if you take 80% of rent of a flat in Knightsbridge, even 80% of that is far too expensive for most people. So one of the things that, and this only happens in certain boroughs, is that the mayor has brought in a living wage rent, which is based at 30% of what is the average wage of somebody in a particular area, to try and relate income to cost. And affordable housing generally is delivered by most of it by the private sector. So if you have a private development, you will need to deliver a certain percentage of affordable homes as a part of that development. When Boris Johnson was mayor, he was fairly relaxed about that, and developers would get away with delivering maybe 15% of units as affordable. Now, under Sadiq Khan, he has a target to deliver 50% on projects, but at the moment, as a sort of stage to 50%, he'll accept 35% affordable on a project. That does have quite substantial problems in terms of delivery of housing, because if developers have calculated their land value based on 15%, they find it very difficult to be able to make a development work financially if they're having to deliver 35 or 50%.
Yeah, Jakub, Dan, is this something you've been facing as well, sort of an increased push to do affordable housing, or at least part of the design?
I mean, there's kind of multiple shared ownership schemes, which I've also kind of find quite kind of beneficial for people that are kind of just right at the they just enter the market, so the first-time buyers. I think those are great schemes. I think there's also, I mean, there's many aspects of gentrifications which are also not negative. I'm actually part of the process because I moved to Hackney. It was back then it was quite deprived. I think over the years, the kind of process of what people would refer to as gentrification has actually transformed Hackney into a borough with kind of, much better schooling system, with lots of kind of culture, program in it. So I think that's, I think it's, it actually comes down to the housing policies. That we need to make sure that the most vulnerable are sort of, or that we allow them to share the profits of the change. But I think the certain shift towards the kind of environment of continuous change, I don't think that's a negative thing. I think it's just we need to make sure that that the benefits are shared.
Going back to your question, I'm not avoiding the affordable housing, which is something that I'm very interested in. However, I think the question was about the deurbanization of this city. I think if there's one theme that we've seen is maybe the reverse of that, that we see urban spaces within the center of our city becoming ever more popular, and really an urban renaissance within the center of our city. I think that's also a generational thing. I think it is the younger people effectively pushing and fueling that, and we may be right. It may be related to when people are having children, they're going out. If they do choose that route. However, I think that is something maybe for this city to think about in terms of there's a question of, for a generation, what kind of city do you want it to be? Do you want to give up the centre, or do you want to live within the city that you come from and reinvestigate that city and make it really write your own stories towards it as against allow that to be written. And I think the basis of that is in creativity, which I think is probably the most fascinating thing that we've seen, is how people have changed the types of function and the mix of functions that occur in buildings within our city. I mean, it's extraordinary. You can find things going from workshops to tech spaces to bars to residential to some kind of art space, all within the same piece, and it might also move market. And it suddenly feels like, I talked about it earlier, that all the old rules have disappeared when it comes to how you use space. But I'm not convinced that works in a suburban environment, particularly a car-based suburban environment where people don't meet and they don't get together to do stuff in the same way. I think it needs a certain degree of intensity and a certain degree of location that comes from that. So I think that piece I'd be very nervous about for this city if it doesn't happen. I think also, obviously, a suburban piece without I mean, you have good transport infrastructure here, but car reliance on that suburban piece is a disaster sustainability-wise. I mean, absolute disaster. We want to be trying to live more close to where we work and to cut down those journey times, and to effectively a relatively high density urban piece is a very good idea for that. So that would be, I guess, my take on it.
Thank you very much. Any other question for our speakers today?
Thanks. There was an article in the Economist, British newspaper, about the Internet of Things. Actually, inflation of the sensors in the buildings, on the street, and a lot of new information is available about the pedestrian movements, about logistic habits. And the question is how this big data analysis should impact the urban planning. Thanks.
This for
I think that's very much a
Don?
sort of Foster project, isn't it, really?
I think from our point of view, we couldn't get enough data. I mean, the search for data all around the world to assist in urban planning is a constant issue. But actually, the more data you can get, and I mean, it is perfectly possible to model using this data where urban planning ends up, where particularly movements are going to end up, and where densification of the things that you try and do. I think what we should all distrust is where data isn't used. I think that is a disaster area.
where is that?
I'm not going to go through, but I think we have to have an evidential basis to what we do in relationship to urban planning. In particular, we have to make spaces which are right and that we know are going to work. We shouldn't just be trying it out and saying, oh, well, that didn't work, so let's try it something different. And we should be very nervous about those kind of pieces that aren't based on something empirical.
Thank you. There was another question over there.
I'd like to ask about, we saw the figures growing of the population of London City in the 90s, and one of the reasons you mentioned was that there was migration from the European Union. So basically, I really didn't want to meddle into the grounds of Brexit or anything, but the projections that we saw that we need around 660,000 units per year, are those figures that are simulated using Brexit as a scenario of maybe a slowdown, or are these figures, because maybe the impact of Brexit would be a slowdown in London population, maybe people going out of it and more into Europe, mainland. So I was just wondering if these figures are, how these figures work, and what is the effect of Brexit on the urban structure of London expansion in the future?
Yeah, well, that is very interesting, and one that we don't have a full answer to until we've negotiated all the various agreements with the EU. So, but I'm hoping that maybe Brexit will be abandoned and we will stay in the European Union. So we wait to see. But as far as I understand it, from the demographer's point of view, is that actually we had an increase in immigration during the Blair government, but and a lot of those people coming were younger people who then got married. They're now having children, and so a lot of the growth which is happening now in the near future is actually by people who are now Londoners living in London, and increasing number of households, and increasing having children as well. But growth of households is one of the key reasons why we need housing, as well as growth of population.
But maybe if I could ask, has Brexit influenced you in your business so far, or has it been noticeable a lot, or not so much?
Yeah, I mean, in our case, it's the second. I don't think there was any kind of significant impact of Brexit in our practice. I don't know. I mean, we don't have many projects in Europe, and unfortunately, we also not as popular in Britain. But but we're doing very well in Asia and in other parts of the world. So. Yeah, so I mean, there wasn't a real impact, and I think you know it's I think you can't predict anything that is related to Brexit. I think we learned that over the couple of years that we're now going through that, and I think some people will also see that as an opportunity. So obviously there will be other forces that will kind of move certain things, that they will again impact other things. I think it's really kind of I mean I can't tell.
Well,
what about
Patrick Schumacher is a great supporter of Brexit, isn't he?
Yeah, Foster and Partners. How has that influenced you?
I'd like to address that point, the questioner first, because I was at a meeting at Parliament the other day, just before the first of the prorogation, just on the day of the prorogation recess, and with a think tank that was looking at immigration piece post-Brexit. And the answer they gave was that still an incredible amount of immigration coming into the UK, but proportionally a bit less from Europe and proportionally a bit more from the rest of the world, which was the change they were looking at. I think perhaps the saddest thing that maybe we should take to our minds is that the real effect of what would be a really, I think, chaotic Brexit would probably be worst felt in the areas outside London, and those are the areas that most likely voted for that result. Which I think is incredibly sad, as it turns out. Just in terms of our workload, I mean, I think the key issue to us is, you know, we really enjoy working in Europe. We really enjoy, we consider ourselves to be European, so that is part of what we do. We don't think that will stop, but it's certainly not necessarily as secure as a piece it once was. There is a concern that we have over that. Ultimately, around the world, a bit like I think probably ZHA, this isn't our biggest market in relationship to what we really do. So I think that's key. But it is one of the pieces that we really enjoy working in and have great passion to work in. Yeah.
I think I would say that London voted to remain, and also London is most economic observers would reckon that London is going to be, as you say, least affected by Brexit of any of the parts of the UK.
It has a thing about it, which is obviously it's a very dynamic city. That's ultimately why it's attracted ultimately the people, and with those people, then a lot of the jobs have come to this place. And it's interesting to think about that. It continues to change, it continues to transform, it continues to evolve as a city, and that's how it should be. It's incredibly dynamic as a piece. So I think that in one sense, that's not going to go away. People are going to really enjoy living there.
Thank you. I'll try to divert the topic from Brexit to the woods. I see lots of timber architecture and structures getting popular in London. And do you think it will anyhow affect the conventional brick and concrete architecture and urbanism in London? And regarding urbanism, sustainable architecture, sustainable urbanism, recycling, do you think those old bodies will change with the effect of using woods, and also the former nightmares of 17th century fires based on foundries? But would you say something about it, like going back to old structures and timbers?
I mean, I can probably address some of this. I talked about this earlier. For us, I think one of the big pieces of our recent work and research and development has been development of embodied energy calculation, or real-time embodied energy calculation as we design buildings. So these decisions shouldn't be left to, again, a non-empirical piece. We should know what we're doing, and we should have an absolute sense of what the best practice is to try to reduce the carbon footprint, not only of the buildings in use, but actually when we're building them, which is, I think, at least 30% of the overall piece of what's actually happening with the building over its lifespan. So, yes, you're right, and I think obviously there's a lot of movement towards using timber, particularly in structures. There's a sort of slightly reverse movement post-Grenfell as towards fire safety in our city that makes people relatively nervous, particularly about high-density timber structures. And so that conversation is not in one direction at the moment, but it's taken very seriously from both pieces.
Yeah, I know a number of projects which have actually changed the specification since Grenfell from cross-laminated timber to more conventional means because of the nervousness of post-Grenfell.
Yeah. I think but it's being a trend. If not in Britain, there's many cities that are looking into that. There's recently the highest. The high rise in Tokyo. I mean, we've done a proposal for full timber stadium not long ago that unfortunately didn't make it through planning, but there is still a hope. So I think that the people are looking into that, and I think I'm one of the really big advocate for timber, and I think timber will re-enter our cities in due course.
Well, Hackney has quite a number of CLT buildings. I mean, towers of 10 stories, which were built over the last 5 years, but I don't know if they've planned any more.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Or do you want to react?
No, I just think, the other thing to think about with timber is it's not simply the embodied energy, it's also the idea of having a material that we as humans feel very, how can I put it, very attracted to, and we enjoy being next to. It's not an artificial piece, and I think that's also to be thought about when we're using it in the city.
Thank you. Over there in the back.
This question is a little bit less serious or less responsible than the previous one. I was just wondering, since Prague is quite conservative with modern architecture and every new building creates a lot of controversy or a lot of discussion, I just wanted to ask if you know if in London, for example, there was an urban development or some building or some project that was met with controversy, or some that was excitedly accepted by the public, by citizens or tourists?
I'm going to answer with one which Peter highlighted earlier, interesting enough, and I think that was Swiss Re. So the Mary Axe, when we built that, there was incredible controversy about it, and it was really interesting to see how that developed, because it was, oh my God, this incredibly different shaped tower, what's that doing in our city? But within a few years, it had been adopted by the city as the symbol of the Olympics. So that was really interesting for us to see how that had changed.
Well, I think also, actually, perhaps as a result of that, when the Shard by Renzo Piano was being built, and ever since, really, it's been more criticized by architects as the way it hits the ground than by the general public, who actually see it as a really positive and rather beautiful addition to the skyline. So I would say that is pretty popular, and something that the Gherkin 30 St Mary Axe led the way. It changed people's attitudes, and I think the Shard benefited from that. Whereas the walkie-talkie, which I pointed out, is probably the least popular building in the whole of London, really. The planning team don't agree from the city.
Jakub, what do you think? You've experienced both the Czech Republic and the UK.
You know, what's again my favorite structure? Yeah, I think Europe is now kind of enjoying a kind of a period of rather kind of conventional projects, but they also that never last long. I think this always comes in waves. I think it's not long ago where we had lots of work in Germany and Belgium, and there were, you know, quite extraordinary structures, and I think you know, this kind of, I think the change of taste might come again. There might be kind of more appetite for certain, let's say, more extraordinary architecture, I would say. So one could also count on that, I think. And I don't know if I can kind of pinpoint as a single development. I think I do quite like the cheese crater. I think it's a very kind of smart structure with the way that it hits the ground. I quite like that, so I do enjoy looking at that building. I think that particular area is quite exciting because things are happening. I like East London as a whole, the way it's developing, especially the borough that I live in. It's in Hackney. I think it's that one wouldn't sort of like point to a single structure that it's leading the way, but I think that the way that they're going about it, I find quite successful.
Thank you. We have time for one last question over here.
I'd like to put you on the spot. When I take my students to London, and as a citizen of London, when I sit or stand on the embankment, and I've got the town hall behind me, I look towards the city and I see the Vignoles building. I have great difficulty to tell students from Central European city like Prague or similar to say that London is beautiful. I'm looking for another word, interesting, someone. How do you see London? Do you think London is beautiful? I'm thinking in particular stretch from, you know, I'm going beyond Somerset House and beyond the Unilever, and I'm looking at the front of the St. Paul's, you know, and the school and so on. And I think they must be one of the ugliest buildings I've ever seen anywhere. On the most prominent site, facing the river. I am aware that the river Thames is not a recreational river, it's a working river, it's very difficult. But actually, there are bits of London which now it's improved the access to St. Paul's, but there are also bits of London newly built since the war, which I would consider to be extremely ugly. And I have really great difficulty to explain students who are coming from what is called beautiful city to tell them that it's beautiful.
I don't think London has ever ever actually been seen as a beautiful city in the same way that you might say Venice is beautiful, or Paris, or even Prague, in quite the same way. So I think that London is interesting, vital, resilient, accepts change, and it also makes quite a lot of mistakes. And actually, along the river, there are quite a lot of mistakes. Taking people on a river trip is not one of the most edifying architectural educations. But I think the walkie-talkie is really a very interesting case, and I ask the people who were involved in the public inquiry about this, how on earth did you support that building? And I don't get a proper answer, really. It's location. It's a location next to the cluster, and the views that you get from, particularly as you look from the east right through the center of Tower Bridge, a key view. It sits right in the middle. It's if the city had had the computer system it has today to assess the impact, it would never have allowed it to happen.
Back to the question, is London beautiful?
I mean, having moved to London from Vienna, I can tell you that initially it was a bit of struggle, but I think that now when I can sort of, connect the dots, I can tell you that London is not a city to visit. I mean, London is a city to experience, it's a city to live in. I think it needs to get under your skin. And when that happens, like, you really do appreciate its beauty. So I think with me it was a bit of process, but I must tell now that I do find the city beautiful.
I'm going to answer this in two ways. I'm from Cardiff in South Wales originally, and I can tell you London's a lot more beautiful, regardless of what you might think coming from Prague. And I think the second point, I'm going to just talk about where you were standing. So you were standing outside the mayor's office. That space. But but think about this. That space didn't exist. That public space that you were standing in simply didn't exist. And people, when we were doing that development for More London, people were talking about, how on earth would you go south of the river? How would you break that last taboo? Why would you do that? So that idea of the evolving city is really, really important. And we change, all of us change how we see that city, and it continues to evolve. And in a way, that for me is the beauty of it. And I think the very life of it is the point.
But also, if you stand there and look at all the people who are also looking at the North Bank, it used to be the case that everyone took selfies and photographs with Tower Bridge in the background. Now, most people will take photographs with the city cluster in the background, because that's what they see as representing a more contemporary city.
All right. Thank you very much. I've been told that it's time to slowly wrap up. So I'd like to thank my guests here. Of course, Peter Murray for his lecture and for his insight, Jakub Klaška, and Mr. Dan Siebert, from Foster & Partners, for joining us here up on stage. Peter will have another lecture tomorrow morning, which will be targeted at students and practitioners of architecture, of course, as well, because it will be targeted at, the topic is communication, right?
Yeah, why architects need to communicate better, and how they can do it.
Well,
can I say?
Of course.
He came into our practice and talked about this. It is very interesting. You should all go along.
Well, there you go. That's the invitation. So tomorrow, 10 o'clock in the morning, you're all welcome here. Thank you very much.